Nice editorial, Karen.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what happens when I get pissed off.
Board members, if we can take our seats so we can get started.
Oh, there we go.
All right, everyone. Well, I'll call on Ms. Pekarsky.
Thank you. In order to comply with Section 2.2-3712D of the Code of Virginia, it's necessary for the board to certify that since the Fairfax County School Board convened a closed meeting on March 8th, 2022, to the best of each member's knowledge, only public business matters lawfully exempted from open meeting requirements, and only such public business matters as were identified in the motion convening the closed meeting were heard, discussed, or considered by the board during this closed meeting. That was moved by Ms. Cohen, seconded by Ms. Corbett Sanders. All those in favor? Okay, that is unanimous with everyone around the table. Thanks, Megan. We have to do Ricky, right?
Yes.
Okay. Ricardi Anderson has submitted a written request to virtually attend today's meeting due to personal conflicts. I will call for a vote from board members who are in person. All those in favor of approving her request, please raise your hands. That is unanimous. Thank you.
Thank you, and welcome everybody to today's work session, Tuesday, March 8th. The first part of our work session will be the Goal 1 report. That is the student success. We will take a break for lunch, and if we are on time, we will start the Goal 2 report at 1:30 this afternoon. I would like to thank all staff who are here today to help with this report. That includes Marty Smith, Sloan Presidio, Noel Klemenko, Leedy Hruda, and also, I want to thank you all for putting together the strategic plan scorecard, which all board members should have at their table. You may find this helpful to look at as we go through the goal reports. And I now call on Ms. Hruda to begin our reports, or Mr. Smith, okay?
Thank you very much. And before Ms. Hruda begins with the reports, I just want to share with the board and the community that once again this year, because of our efforts with managing the pandemic, our Office of Research and Strategic Improvement, they developed the reports this year and worked very closely with departments in creating the responses and working through all of the data and providing the analysis. And so I did want to thank Ms. Hruda and her team for taking that on this year once again, because it's a monumental task. It was work that was once done by individual departments that a very small shop has taken on. So it's important for the board and the community to know that. And we look forward to the discussion today. And we certainly look forward to answering any questions that the board may have.
So thank you, Mr. Smith, and good morning. Today we're here to review the highlights of the school year 2020-2021 Strategic Plan Goal 1 report, which is about our student success goal. And before I get started, I just wanted to also thank specifically Sammy Corrales in my office, who really was the main person pushing forward on this many months process to get this report completed and shared publicly. Now, this work session is support for the upcoming school board vote and we ask that you approve the report in that vote. The report is intended to be used by the school board to inform its policy and budgetary decisions, and it also provides transparency on FCPS's progress on its strategic plan, its efforts to achieve those strategic aspirations, and the associated costs related to activities that we engage in. The report is the school year 2020 to 2021 report. This means it's about last year, and that's the structure of the goal reporting. It's a look back at FCPS's functioning and performance last year, which was an unusual year for us with the COVID pandemic and most of our students being in virtual instruction throughout most of the year. Now, today's presentation will cover highlights of the report. It is posted on board docs, and there's an additional 105-page narrative report that describes most of what we're covering in detail. There is also a highlights document that summarizes it more succinctly. Now, today we'll be focusing on some key points in that reporting. First, we'll discuss linked school board actions, covering what actions the school board took to support the progress and attainment of FCPS's strategic aspirations. We'll also focus on the metric performance, or how FCPS did in this goal area during the reporting year. We'll talk about strategic actions and their related costs. In other words, what did FCPS do last year to try to achieve its strategic aspirations? And then we'll conclude with some conclusions about the goal actions and also about our performance. Now, these three sections were the sections handled by the Office of Research and Strategic Improvement to provide that independent, objective look on how FCPS did with its strategic plan. Subsequent to that, I will turn it over to Ms. Klemenko, who will provide a goal champion response to the conclusions. That will focus on what FCPS is doing now in terms of what we concluded last year. And then the final section of today's presentation, which is titled Future Considerations, will be presented by Dr. Brabrand, and it covers the future strategic, budgetary, and policy considerations that he considers most important to FCPS as we move forward. So before we dive into this, thank you. Okay, thank you. So before we dive into the presentation further, prior to the COVID-19 closure, the FCPS School Board Superintendent and Leadership Team had begun the work of reviewing strategic metrics and updating the division's strategic focus and its associated measures of progress, and that was back in March of 2020. This work had to be put on hold as the division dealt with the many issues that were brought on by the pandemic. Therefore, today's presentation focuses on what FCPS has referred to as the school year 2018-20 strategic focus. Each desired outcome for those focus is listed on this slide, and briefly they are elimination of gaps, early education, and portrait of a graduate attributes. As it does every year, the school board took crucial steps that supported FCPS's efforts to attain its student success goal. You can see that these included approval of multiple critical decisions, such as delaying the start of the school year to allow for teachers to better prepare for the teaching in the instructional environment that existed throughout most of last year. You'll also see the school board's funding of important resources that were needed during the pandemic year, such as the one-to-one devices for all students in grades 3 to 12. Again, these are only highlights of some of the school board's actions that provided support for the student success goal last year. This next slide presents a broad overview of FCPS's progress in its student success goal. The bullets on this slide reflect all of FCPS's strategic aspirations that are part of student success. These 6 aspirations are measured by 22 metrics. For example, for the first aspiration, all students will be successful in reading and mathematics. FCPS measures its progress using several metrics, including the pass rates for each student group are Asian students, Black students, Hispanics, white students, as well as our English learner students, economically disadvantaged students, and FCPS's students with disabilities. measuring that on the SOL reading and math tests. This allows FCPS to measure and judge whether each group is individually making the expected progress on the metric. The data in the table on this slide is a summary of FCPS's progress last year on the 22 student success metrics. You can see that about half of the metrics, the ones that are in the teal boxes, showed FCPS making progress or meeting its targeted aspirations. The other half showed no progress during the year. The first page of the highlights document that's posted on Board Docs for this session provides information about which metrics fell into each of the categories: meeting, progressing, no progress, or no data available, along with more detailed information about the metric data for each student group. School board members have a hard copy of that printout as indicated previously. Now moving on to some more details about the metric performance and highlights around them. This slide describes the main patterns that we're seeing over those 22 metrics. Firstly, on the positive side of making progress or meeting our targets, FCPS continued to narrow access and opportunity gaps, measuring FCPS improvement in ensuring that programs and services were equally available to students from all student groups, and that students in fact participated or took up the opportunity to participate more equally across all our student groups. Narrowing of gaps in access and opportunity last year included providing students with access to technology, providing access and opportunity for advanced academic programs and advanced coursework, and these improvements reduced opportunity and access gaps for our traditionally underrepresented student groups. The metrics that showed no progress largely reflected achievement. As has been discussed and shared previously with the school board and the public, the metric data showed that declines in students' SOL performance compared to previous years, and also larger achievement gaps. Now, FCPS was not alone in seeing this declining achievement pattern, as it was typical across Virginia and the US during last year. In fact, overall, FCPS's SOL pass rates in reading and mathematics were higher than the state average. In other words, even though we saw drops in our SOL performance, FCPS continued to outperform what happened across Virginia. There were specific areas of concern, however. In particular, FCPS underperformed compared to the state on the SOLs with our Hispanic students, our economically disadvantaged students, and our English learners group. On the more positive side, all of our student groups did meet or exceed the target for on-time graduation rates. However, we continue to see differences in the proportions within different student groups who are earning advanced versus standard high school diplomas, and this means that while our student groups are all showing good progress in graduating, they are not necessarily graduating with equivalent levels of high school preparation, which needs to be understood better. Moving on to our early education metric, data on this metric tracked very similar results to what we saw with SOL performance, meaning that we saw a decline in the preparation of our kindergarten students as they entered kindergarten and came into the school system. Our data did, however, continue to show that students with pre-kindergarten experience were more likely to meet the benchmark than students without such an experience. So students who participated in our FCP program fared better than if they had not participated in preschool. Lastly, our metric data to gauge progress on the Portrait of a Graduate attributes outcome continues to be unavailable, in part due to COVID-19 closure that prevented schools from engaging students in presentations of learning. Now, this next slide focuses on the actions that FCPS undertook to attain its aspirations during the school year 2019-20. School year 2020-21. In other words, it answers the question, what was FCPS doing last year to try to meet its aspirational targets, and what were the associated investments of funds in these actions? The actions were provided to us by the gold champion who oversaw the work. The costs that are listed here represent operating costs. Also listed on the slide is a breakdown of whether staff time was involved, materials or equipment, or other costs that contributed to that overall operating cost that's listed. The majority of costs for most of these actions represent central and school-based staff time to plan, implement, or participate in the efforts. These costs are computed based on a description of the amount of time that staff spent engaged in the activity. An example of this is that the first action for FCPS on expansion totaled approximately $39 million, with about half of that accounting for by staff time spent to handle FCPS on, and the remaining half related to costs for the devices themselves. The report also includes ROI analyses of these costs in relation to performance data. A few other actions of note on this list are specific to the COVID pandemic. Providing professional development for virtual and concurrent learning and streamlining the curriculum. These are actions that were specifically defined by what was going on last year and needed by what was going on last year. The investment in expanding FCPS's multi-tiered systems of support and graduation resources may have been particularly important during the pandemic, but are also investments that will continue to be important moving forward. Now on this slide, you'll see similar actions and costs related to the other two outcomes for early education and for Portrait of a Graduate attributes. Again, these costs represent the operating costs. So for example, for FCP, the overall roughly $26 million cost last year for FCP included grants and transfers, so the only costs that are listed here are the $12 million in operating costs that was spent on the program. So now we're going to take a look at the conclusions for the goal. This is a look at the performance data and at the actions that are associated with it, as well as the investment that FCPS made in resources. This slide highlights not only some of the important insights, but how well these actions were working or might work, but also draws conclusions based on analyses that ORSI undertook of the metric data and at times additional data. All of which is outlined in the report. Last year was historic. The COVID pandemic required FCPS to change what it was doing at its very core. Required tireless efforts on many fronts in order to do this. And we know that student achievement was down, but we don't know how much worse it might have been without these efforts. The strategic actions in school year 2020 to 2021 to eliminate gaps were generally unique to the pandemic circumstances. As shown in the costs for the strategic actions that we just looked at, staff invested considerable time on actions to support virtual learning last year. This reflects FCPS's desire to manage the difficult circumstances of the situation as well as possible, and many of those actions will not need to be continued. For example, as stated in the third bullet, streamlining the curriculum and providing professional development on virtual and concurrent teaching were necessary investments to respond to COVID-interrupted instructional delivery. Other actions will serve FCPS longer term, especially given the lower academic performance that was seen last year. Things such as FCPS continuing to expand MTSS into the future will help it and all of our students recover from the impact of the pandemic. The actions taken to improve graduation rates are grounded in research and best practice, so should have positive effects over time. So while 8 of our 11 schools who received on-time graduation resource teachers showed improved graduation rates compared to prior years, FCPS should continue to monitor the extent of their impact given the timing of the resources within the context of the pandemic. Additionally, FCPS should prepare to address unfinished learning and the widened gaps over multiple years. This is an important thing that we've discussed before, but it's very important for everyone to remember that resolving or finishing the unfinished learning that happened last year will take many years to help recover. And in closing gaps, one focus of equity work would be around the reasons for the differences in the types of diplomas earned by students. We need to better understand why students may be choosing, or potentially there may be systemic things happening that are supporting different types of diplomas being earned by students in different student groups. And now that FCPS has attained its aspiration to provide computing devices to all students, it's important to focus on objectives that reflect the integration of technology into teaching and learning. So going beyond the provision of the devices to how we're using the devices in our classrooms. And then lastly, FCPS made progress toward aspirations of similarly high participation across students in accessing the higher rigor program. Our closing of our access and our opportunity gaps continues to improve. Now moving on to the other two outcomes, taking a look specifically at early education, we know that fewer students met our executive functioning standards when they arrived for kindergarten last year. FCPS has done some work to enhance screening and social emotional support for our preschoolers that should help mitigate these effects over time and hopefully improve the performance in future years. It's also important because we hadn't had the Bridge to K program during the reporting year to make sure that's restarted and to continue to invest in pre-kindergarten and work with our county partners to prepare children for success in kindergarten and close those preparedness gaps that we're seeing. In terms of Portrait of a Graduate, this largely was not the main focus of what was going on last year because of the pandemic. However, the increase in students who engaged in performance-based assessments supports meaningful progress in assessing the development of students with POG skills. And our request that was approved by the school board and ultimately by the Virginia Department of Ed to be designated a school division of innovation would promote all students participating in presentations of learning to assess the POG attributes that are of interest to us, and doing this by 2026. And with that, I will turn it over to Ms. Klemenko, who will provide the Gold Champion response.
So thank you, Ms. Haruda, and good morning, everyone. It's nice to see everyone. I want to first start by saying just thank you to Orsi. The team at Orsi has been wonderful collaborators and leaders in this work, so we appreciate that. I also just want to comment that over there's a row of director types behind and a few others. Dr. King is over there, who will be here with us during this presentation to support questions at the end. So I think this report is really challenging. It's challenging because it's got this big old asterisk of the pandemic on it, and I think it's also challenging because it's a look-back report. Primarily, we are looking at data and actions from last school year, and here we sit, we're almost 3/4 of the way through this school year, so it feels, it's unsettling maybe, perhaps for you all. It certainly can be confusing to write for all of us as we're living in the moment and looking back at the same time. So I'm going to just take a couple minutes to hit a few highlights from last year and then spend predominantly my time talking about the actions that are underway. So taking a look up here, some of these things you'll hear will sound very familiar to what you've heard from the report, but just wanting to draw attention to a few of the highlights. First of all, due to the actions of this board and ISD and IT and several other departments, not to mention the heroic lift of schools, namely the T-SPECs and the SBITs, we were able to provide devices to all of our students and connectivity, which ensured that access to virtual instruction that was critical last year. We also redesigned all the resources, as was mentioned, pivoting, and it was rather late in the game where we knew we were pivoting to all virtual instruction, was the effort of people in ISD, Office of School Support, Title I, OPLFE, lots of people coming together to try and do this, along with many, many teachers who gave many hours outside the contract day to ensure that we had new pacing, that we had ready-to-go lessons, that we had assessments that would work in a virtual environment to ensure that high-quality instruction would continue. That we provided last summer with ESSER funds, we were able to provide a very robust summer program for the first time in a very long time. We had a program at every elementary and middle school that supported Bridge to K, Bridge to First, math and language arts instruction, and young scholars. Really a much more robust program than we'd had in many, many years. We also had high school credit recovery at every high school and credit accrual through our online campus. And for the first time, we had free seats to our enrichment programs for students who were on free and reduced meals, which is something hopefully we'll be able to continue into the future. We also revised, and you all were part of many of this, many regulations and policies and practices, really to ensure that what we were doing was appropriate for virtual learning, and that we were holding a high standard for students, but not holding them sort of hostage to being part of this pandemic closure. With your assistance, we piloted local norms, which resulted in 367 students being identified to the second grade testing pool automatically, right, without a referral, that they would not have been identified if we only used national norms. So that is something, as you know, we're continuing as well. And those division efforts to really continue to look at access and opportunity was not just for level 4 and at elementary school, but certainly we continue those efforts at secondary, most notably, and you will see that in the honors participation and their performance. So those are just a few of the highlights of last year as we sort of turn the page and we start to come current and think about what's happening this year as we start to emerge and almost respond to some of this data. One thing I want to say before I dig in is that hopefully the things you're going to hear are familiar to you. The work of the strategic plan does not live outside all the other work. It is the work, right? It's the work that the central offices do every day and the work that the schools and where we're all headed. So hopefully a lot of these things will be just connecting dots and seeing how these things fit together and how they align with this plan. So taking them first, we have 3 desired outcomes in Goal 1. The first one is the elimination of gaps in opportunity, access, and achievement. So this one is probably the most robust and the one we spend the most energy on as a division. And I want to just hit some of the things that we're doing to sort of mitigate that learning loss in the areas of reading and math. Once again, we came back to school this year having redesigned curriculum for virtual learning. Now we needed to redesign curriculum for students who were coming out of virtual learning and students who had different kinds of learning experiences, different kinds of assessment, and essential standards, and we knew that there were gaps. So there was, again, another redesign that took place. We also learned a lot during the pandemic and leveraging some of the virtual tools that showed success so that we could continue with personalization, and differentiation was important. The next 3 bullets that you see there are really related to ESSER. So I think it was just a couple weeks ago, we were all here talking about the ESSER plans and the way we're spending funds and the school plans. And those are very much actions that are in line with eliminating these gaps and mitigating learning loss. So whether it be the creation of the plans, the resources that central office creates to help with those plans, including tutoring and mentoring, whether it is the use of MTSS, which was certainly a research-based process that was highlighted in the report, the additional compensation for special education teachers, all these things working together to work to mitigate that learning loss and lessen gaps. It was about 6 months ago that we were here together to talk about equitable access to literacy and really making a change to the way we're approaching literacy. And I think I'm so tired because of that work, but I'm also really excited because of that work. It is a big lift, and we have accomplished a lot in 6 months. We've stood up a project management team so that we can really do this in a very strategic and thoughtful way as we make these changes pre-K-12. We have implemented phonics and phonological awareness across all of our schools and provided the associated professional development. So while we are making big changes, we did not want to wait, and we wanted to start chipping away at this work. And then finally, just tomorrow night will be the final meeting of the Basal Resource Adoption Committee. And so I'm looking forward in the next few weeks to bringing more information to you about that. Sticking with eliminating the gaps for just a couple more minutes, I think it would be, I think it's important to kind of call out some of the intentional actions for English learners and for students with disabilities. Starting with English learners, we firmly believe that if we are going to eliminate gaps and support our English learners, every teacher in our school division needs to be a teacher of ELS. They need to have skills, they need to have knowledge and dispositions in order to reach and teach those students. So this year, to that end, we've put in some required professional development that all teachers and all administrators must take on the essential ELS, really helping them know how to scaffold instruction and engage ELS in the classroom. This is like a first step right? It's a first step in ensuring that we can take collective responsibility for the success of our English learners. Beyond professional development, the ESOL office, led by Mr. Polio that's here, has been out and about in schools. And it's been great that we've been able to be back in person, back in schools. They visited over 100 schools, doing kind of strategic visits to really learn what's happening and provide feedback. And then what happens after those meetings is the new ESOL coaches are able to go back and provide that targeted and specific supports to schools. So it's a great system where they can learn what's happening in schools, meet with administrators, and also provide that very targeted support. Moving on to special education, they are also very much into building the capacity of their staff members. They are providing increased coaching and training on our intervention materials, which is very critical to mitigating learning loss, as well as multisensory instruction. And both of those things are aligned to and also further our equitable access to literacy work. They also are working hard with the Great Beginnings teachers. You know that we have a lot of provisionally certified special education teachers, and it's critical that we work with them so that we can ensure high-quality instruction and make sure those teachers have the capacity, the confidence, and really the desire to stay in the field and to stay in Fairfax County Public Schools. So for this desired outcome, we have a lot of work happening that hopefully we will start to see that impact, though as Ms. Ruda said, it will take years, but we are starting that work very intentionally. We have two other desired outcomes in this goal, and the next one is all future FCPS families will access high-quality early learning experiences. I think a lot of people on this board share my love of the Bridge to K program. It has been a true success of this division where students who have previously not accessed preschool come in the summer and really have opportunities to build executive functioning and self-regulation skills prior to entering kindergarten. During that first summer of the pandemic, we were not able to have Bridge to K, so last year, as I mentioned, we came back with full Bridge to K in every elementary school that has a kindergarten program. And we are very happy that we will be doing that again this coming year. We do think it is critical to set these students up for success. Data and assessment is really important as we really think about how we're going to support not only the students but the teachers. One of the assessment systems that we're using right now is called CLASS, the Classroom Assessment Scoring System. And this allows us to collect data about the quality of instruction happening in a classroom, as well as the student and teacher interactions. And after that data is collected, the early childhood team can go in and coach and support the teaching teams to really bring about improved classroom experiences. The other set of data that's incredibly important is our student data, which we collect each year through the VKRP that allows us to really pinpoint those individual student needs. And finally, the explicit partnering with parents is incredibly important to ensure that we are really building their skills and knowledge and supporting their child with readiness. And moving on to the last and final desired outcome, that all FCPS pre-K students will continuously progress their development of Portrait of a Graduate attributes. You know, the Portrait of a Graduate is a commitment that the school board and the division has made since 2014 at this point. Really to ensure that we are focusing education in order for students to build the skills of a collaborator, a communicator, a critical and creative thinker, a global and ethical citizen, and someone who is goal-oriented and resilient. I think all of us can agree those are really important to be productive citizens in a global environment and to be workforce ready. So this commitment has been long-standing and certainly permeates far beyond just this desired outcome. But this desired outcome really asks for us to be able to measure it. And that is a different ask than just doing it or thinking about it or talking about it. And this has been a long time coming, and every year we get to this point in the report and we go, oh, no data again. And it's so disappointing because the work has been happening and we've made progress, and certainly it has been paused, a little bit stalled due to the pandemic. We do have 23 schools that even during the pandemic were not willing to give this up. So we have 23 pilot schools who are piloting what we call presentations of learning, or I should say, Portrait of a Graduate presentations of learning, otherwise known as POGPOL. They are piloting this where students actually curate evidence from the work they do in class, not different work, but from the work they're doing in class, and really reflect on how they are building the skills that are identified in the Portrait of a Graduate. So we have 23 schools who are doing that, and through a collaboration that has continued during this pandemic with ISD and IT, we do have a data reporting and analytics tool that we will be able to collect data for the first time. So this, as we come out of the pandemic and re-engage, really sets us up to be able to report data for all schools as we move this forward in future reports. And the final thing I just want to mention is the School Division of Innovation, Ms. Haruta mentioned. We were awarded this by VDOE. That really provides a couple things. It provides us the ability to continue with performance-based assessments that we started a little bit during the pandemic with some flexibility that was given by the state. And it also sort of puts a little bit of pressure on us to move this POG poll thing along and really stay true to our outcomes of really identifying where students are and measuring their growth over time with those attributes. So I really appreciate the time to be able to share some of the work that's in progress and the intentions behind it. So I will turn it over to Dr. Brabrand.
Thank you, Ms. Klemenko, and thank you, Sloan and Leedy, really the entire team that's here. And we're going to just wrap up this presentation and then take questions from board members on this important work. A couple of things I just want to take away, the nuggets, as I would say. I know you won't hear that much longer, but I'm sharing it because that's how I think about some of these presentations. A couple of things that you've heard, I just want to remind you. The pandemic has been 2 years. It's not going to be a 2-week or a 2-month fix to the issues that have been presented through the pandemic. We do have a lot of work to do, and we've been busy at work through the pandemic, and now as we're coming out of the pandemic, to do everything we can to meet every child by name and by need. I'm really happy. One of the things, this scorecard, I love this scorecard. We worked on it. You know, this didn't exist 4 or 5 years ago. In a snapshot, how are we doing? And it is a mixed record of what we've been able to do. One of the things I'm very excited about is we have been able to move graduation rates in a dynamic way across all of our subgroups. The grow, if you will, is to dive in deeper in those graduation rates about the standard diploma and the advanced diploma, and getting more of our subgroups to get into that access to rigor that is reflective in the advanced diploma. I think this is work that's being talked about at the state level. Our new governor is interested in talking about advanced academics and access to that, and this is maybe an area where we can find common ground, and we all agree that access to this advanced rigor gives kids access to the advanced diploma and more opportunities as they graduate from our schools. So I welcome that additional work. And something that's already been flagged, but we will have to keep our eyes on, is our earliest learners. The kindergarten cohort data for executive functioning is not a surprise, but it is a serious thing that we're going to have to monitor. We're going to need to monitor those kindergartner kids as they come up into first grade. And we're going to need to monitor the next cohort that comes in and track how they're doing in terms of executive functioning skills. So we really do need to keep an eye on that as well. If we can go, so those are some, one other thing before we move off strategic, let's go back one other slide. I won't be here to see it. Right before the pandemic, we were having a work session on the strategic plan. Many of you were brand new and said, wow, you know, what about this, what about that? When I arrived, the strategic plan had been done by the prior administration and the prior school board, and they were proud of what's in there. We need to do a reset of the strategic plan that is now multiple years old. We have 22 metrics in Goal 1. It's too many. We had too many desired outcomes in the strategic plan when I arrived, and that's why we did a strategic plan focus to narrow the number of outcomes from almost 40 to about 8. But even with that 8, we now, out of this pandemic, need to narrow our focus even more to less desired outcomes and less metrics to measure if we want the accountability and the fidelity of implementation that I've heard this board talk about so many times. I'm confident that this staff is ready to work with you on a more strategic focus of the strategic plan and on a narrowed number of metrics that focus not on what we've already accomplished, but where we need to go, including foundational skills in reading and math. And you've heard Noelle talk already about our new approach to reading, which is so important as we go into this next year. The next slide, I want to just leave you with a few things, is about budget considerations. Obviously, we want to continue to support teacher planning and professional development. That's already in the budget with some additional calendar days. And I shared with you at a work session 2 weeks ago that even as we're talking about that, our elementary principals are saying we don't just want days, we want the planning time throughout the year. And I have some proposals that we are looking at, and by April 14th, I'm going to take all of that follow-on, all of the things you've shared, and try to come together and bring solutions for many of those issues. But that planning time we know needs to continue. Our English language learners is in the budget. We have a 3-year plan to add 50 additional teachers each year. I'm proud of that work. The state board, I hope, will continue to recognize, and I am proud to see that the governor rescinded a board member in the Commonwealth who felt that investing in English language learners was not the appropriate thing. And our state leadership appropriately said investing in all of our kids, especially our English language learners, has to continue. And we've been doing that in Fairfax, not just by words, but by actual financial investments. And that should continue, along with the PD that Noelle talked about, to give them the skills so that every teacher can be a teacher of English language learners. I also just want to mention, we talked about these gaps in reading and math. One thing, just real time, remember, we just turned on the faucet to tutoring. The massive tutoring RFP has been finalized. We're now going to turn that faucet on and give every kid access to a high-quality tutor. I'm very excited about that, and I think it's going to be foundational, especially for reading and math, but all subjects for kids to be able to do better. And we want to continue that. She's already mentioned, Noelle did, the equitable access to literacy. We're finishing up our basal recommendation, and very excited about that. And it is a game changer. And change, like many things we've done in this system, like many things, there are differences of opinion, but the data doesn't lie. We've had an approach to reading for too long that has had disproportionate impacts on kids, and it's time for a new approach that gets better results for our children. I want to mention one of the other things. Again, I've already mentioned the kindergarten that's mentioned there on one of the last bullets for the budget. We'll continue to look at that. And we'll continue to look, as we already did in this budget, with some of the ESSER stuff that we did one time to look at continuing over. Some of you even talked just recently, hey, we've had monitors. Can we use an idea to use monitors to do things like elementary planning time? Stand by for that in a few weeks. But are there things that we're doing using ESSER funds that can become permanent ways of supporting our schools? And then finally, I know this was a future consideration that ORC shared, and we talked about capturing the commitment to equity and access for advanced program opportunities. But I also think there's space for this board and for our community to reaffirm our commitment to One Fairfax, to reaffirm our commitment to equity. Equity isn't a dirty word. Equity is a necessary word if we are going to move forward our students and staff and realize the strategic vision that's in here of every child by name and by need. And I think One Fairfax has been a good foundation, but we need to clarify and continue to clarify what those commitments mean to the school system, to the leadership team, and I'm confident we can do that as well, doing it together. And I'll leave you with part of that equity journey is really fulfilling the promise of Portrait of a Graduate that we really were starting in schools and building. There's not just a Portrait of a Graduate work we've done in Fairfax. It shaped the state has Portrait of Graduate, Portrait of a Virginia Graduate. And this is some of the common ground I think we can get to, is not arguing over things that are going to take us back, but collaborating on the things that can take us forward and take our kids so that out of this pandemic, our kids have the skills to be successful. I appreciate your all's listening to us for the last 45 minutes, and we look forward to your comments, your questions, and the conversation. So thank you.
Well, thank you all. I now will go to board questions, and we will have 3 minutes in this first go-round. I will start with Laura Jane, followed by Ms. Cohen, followed by Ms. Tolan.
Thank you. Laura Jane is just fine. I can't agree more with what you said about redoing this. I think, as we said, I remember very fondly that last meeting. I felt like, oh my gosh, we are in such a good path, and everybody's really on the same page, and then the rug got pulled out from underneath us. So I do think you have a board commitment that we agree that we would like to see a pretty significant revision. I also would say, in the midst of that rug being pulled out from underneath us, that if we just go back to what we were doing before the pandemic, we would be making such a big mistake. And this is looking at a pre-pandemic world. We've learned so much about what our kids need, what our staff needs. If we just go back to business as usual, we're doing such a disservice, I think, to our families and our staff. My first question was about Bridge to K. And I just wanted to clarify, I know we have traditionally limited that to kids who did not have a preschool experience. Is that going to be the case again this year?
So that would be the priority group. Yes, I do think, and I'm looking at Ms. Burke, who's over there, if there are seats that can't be filled in a particular school, I think then it does go beyond that. But the first priority would go to students who have not had a pre-K experience.
I would really love for us to have a broader conversation, and it may just be that it's a staffing issue too, so I want to be respectful of that. But I would argue that the vast majority of our kids walking into kindergarten even next year have not had a normal pre-K experience, even if they've had some access to pre-K. The vaccine was so late in coming for the littlest ones that I just don't think, I think it's a big reflection, as we all know, of like what we're seeing. So the other piece to that is, I think, to use your words, there was a nugget that if they had pre-K experience, our kids were more successful coming into kindergarten last year. And so I guess I would love to hear more about how we are going to strategically work then to grow that opportunity with the county, if there's anyone who can speak to that.
Well, I could certainly try to do that. And we actually had a great conversation, I think just yesterday, Ms. Burke and I did, with Ms. Derenak Kofax, who was the board member, one of the board members on the original inaugural SCIP committee, where there was a big focus on the part of the county and the school system to expand early childhood education. And we've got to figure out how to get back to that commitment and to that focus. So we will be having some follow-up conversations in the executive SCIP committee about how we can renew a focus on early childhood education. But really, it does come down to funding. I mean, that is the bottom line. There's funding on the staffing side to increase the capacity of access to those programs. And then there's some funding requirements on the facilities and capital side. Because we do need to have more facility space to be able to expand our program. And that's one of the things that we've run into in the past. But we had a good discussion about that yesterday. And I think one of the recommendations that I had is, as the board thinks about what you would like the strategic plan to look like in the future, one of the things to consider is a timeline of reporting that would coincide with your ability to develop the budget for the school system, to be able to identify, for example, strategic targets of expanded capacity to pre-K that you might want to set as a target or a goal in future years, and then partner with the county to figure out, you know, as the county develops their budget and the school system develops our budget, what that commitment would look like on an annual basis to be able to actually create that additional capacity. So great question. I appreciate you asking it, and certainly appreciate Ms. Derenak Kofax's advocacy for that as well.
Thank you. I will look forward to that. And I think some of it comes from creative placement too, that we really have not had that conversation as much as we should be in the county, using some of our rec centers and different things like that. Another question that I had when I look here is, we had $890,000 of support for historically underrepresented students in advanced coursework. I wonder if you could talk about that a little more.
Can I come back to it? I just have to find it in my binder.
Sure,
Just give me a
yeah.
moment.
I'll pontificate while you look, which is just to say that when we look at the percentage of students who participate in AB, IP, IB, dual enrollment, we still don't have the SPED supports, and I know so much of it is staffing. I don't mean this as, I know you recognize it, but the barrier for kids to participate is easy to see with our SPED kids, that we don't offer, I don't know of many schools at all that offer any kind of team taught opportunities in a lot of these courses, and we have kids who just cannot participate without that. And so when we talk about SPED staffing, and I know we're waiting for the review, but we have got to figure out a way to do that, which I know means making people materialize out of thin air, but it's been a long-going frustration.
So what I would say is, that doesn't include any kind of staffing, right? It includes the creation of resources or professional development for really advising students and for helping them to make selections and utilize open enrollment.
And I think a large component of that is existing staff time to do those things, not new budgetary investments, so.
Thank you. Ms. Tolan.
Thank you. I'm happy to follow Dr. Brabrand and Ms. Cohen. When I read through all of this, it was, as Noelle said, it was kind of a look back and then a bit of a look forward. And we have some good news and some highlights, but then we have some bad news. But the bad news is not surprising. It's like we've been talking about it, all along. So what I really want us to focus on is, what are those metrics moving forward, the whole strategic planning process that we've talked about and Dr. Brabrand talked about. But also more importantly, like, what are the solutions that we're going to start working on and looking toward? And Noelle, you listed a whole bunch of those, kind of as your response. But I would be really interested to hear, like the school, division of innovation, that work's been going on for a number of years. Community schools came to mind. We had a recent conversation on that. How could that be implemented as a solution for some of the issues, that we're seeing here? But then also, how will we monitor the success of any of these things that we're trying? I know you mentioned a couple of different ways, but, so as your team, like, how are you looking at what are potential solutions and how will we monitor the success of those solutions broadly?
So I guess it kind of depends on what the action is, right? I mean, I think if we take one of the things, I'm just talking off the top of my head, tutoring, right? We're putting tutoring in, it's going to be open to everybody, but we're really going to have to examine who's accessing it, how often they're accessing it. So really taking a look at the data that comes from it. There's also taking a look and seeing if our communication's effective and all the different parts to it. So I think collectively, we can look at the results in this report to see if our actions are working, but independently, each action needs to kind of be looked at through a lens of impact.
Right. Okay. So we'll look forward to hearing more about each of those impacts. And also, Laura Jane, I appreciate your question on early education. I was just going to mention to folks, great minds think alike. With Megan at McLaughlin and I being on Skipped, we had asked for when we saw the early childhood presentation in December to Skipped, we then asked for a follow-up meeting on, more, strategically, how are we looking at achieving the goals that we have for early childhood education across the county. And of course, with our all hands on deck with Omicron, that has been postponed. So we'll look to have that presentation in the next couple of weeks. So I just wanted to make sure the board was aware of that. I read with interest the information. Of course, we've now provided devices to all of our students. Could you talk a little bit more about the PD, and this maybe ties into this whole PD plan that we're looking at for next year too, that is coming to us at some point. How does the professional development for using devices in the classroom as teaching tools, how will that be addressed over the next year? And maybe as part of that, I don't know if I misread this in the report, in the introduction, it mentions that the evaluation of FCPS on has been halted. So I didn't know if that meant that the Hopkins work is no longer going on. I'm wondering what's going on with that.
So we had to shift the focus, right, because they couldn't necessarily be in schools and stuff, but we have, I believe we put out in a Braeburn briefing just maybe a month ago, all the different FCPS on reports from Hopkins, and we have continued that. So I don't think that there has been actually a halt in it. It just shifted, so it may have felt a little bit different than what we were previously doing when we were open.
Just to maybe add a little bit more to that, now that every student has a device, the focus of our partnership with Hopkins is really focused more on how those devices are actually being used. So future partnership work with them will expand on what they've done in the past in terms of classroom observations, focus group interviews with teachers, students, administrators, and families about, how the impact of the technology availability is actually changing teaching and learning. And their last report, and it was included in a Braeburn briefing a few weeks ago, kind of shows that shift in our partnership with them and the reporting that they're doing to the board and community.
Okay, good. I'm glad that's continuing. And can you talk a little bit about the professional development that'll be happening?
Time.
Oh, sorry.
Can I answer real quick?
Yeah, go ahead.
Sure.
Absolutely. She
Prior
got
to
it
the-
in.
Yeah, prior to the pandemic, right, we would have brought school teams out to do FCPS on kind of training. They would have been the leaders to go back into their building and do things. But since the pandemic, and even this year, with returning to school with the lack of substitutes, we were not able to just pull people out for professional development. So the model definitely has shifted to more job embedded, with our SBITs really leading that, with us providing resources and supports, with using Schoology to provide more information and more opportunities, and leveraging MyPDE for asynchronous training. So the model is changing because there is not that space. Now, we may be able to return to pulling people out and doing some training, but in general, I think teachers are really getting much more job embedded, where they're being coached through their if they're in their CT, how do we leverage technology, and the SBIT's there to support that.
Thank you. Ms. Keys-Gamarra.
Thank you. I really appreciate this report, and I appreciate the focus, because I think the community needs to see us focusing on student success. This is the meat of what we do. And so some of my comments is going to be about how this report communicates to everyone, right? And so one of the things that sticks out to me is the desired outcomes. While I completely agree with them, I'm not sure that it really addresses, if a parent is trying to figure out what are the goals of FCPS, I'm not sure that all parents would be able to see the needs of their child in those desired outcomes. And so I offer that as, I guess, an overall consideration as to how we present it, because whatever we put out becomes the topic of someone's discussion, and if it doesn't tell the whole story, I know that we're doing this work. I'm not criticizing us for that at all. I just am not sure it's being communicated when we talk about student success. So if anybody wants to talk a little bit about how we might improve that, I'm happy to hear it. But I do agree with what's in here. I agree with the work that's being done. I just think when other people look at it, does it send the message of what we're doing overall?
Yeah, I think it's a really important point, and I would say it gets back to that discussion right before the pandemic that the board was having about the language used in the strategic plan as well as the goals, right? So it's, what work are we doing and how do we communicate about the work that we're doing? The desired outcomes that you're referencing, those are board-approved desired outcomes. So we're reporting on those 3 board-approved desired outcomes. That was the board language in terms of the desired outcomes associated with the student success goal. But it's a lot of language for somebody in the public who's not part of these discussions to understand. You have a goal, you have desired outcomes, you have aspirations, you have metrics, you have targets, right? It's a lot. And so I think your comments are really important for all of us to consider when we do that strategic plan review and revision work.
I agree. I was hoping he'd be back, but I agree with his earlier comments, right? I'm just concerned with what the community can do with this. Just a few clarifying questions. Ms. Clemenco, you mentioned the School of Distinguished Innovation. Could you explain a little bit what that is?
So VDOE provided the opportunity for us to apply to be a school division of innovation. That, I think it probably came through the board in the fall, but very quickly. Basically, we applied to show that we had sort of the capacity and we had the structure in order to move forward with innovative practices, and we picked in the area of assessment. So we wanted to have the opportunity to engage with the state, that they would consider us for waivers. So if we wanted to move away from doing some multiple choice testing and wanted to use performance-based assessment instead, that we would be primed to do that, and the state was on board with us doing that. They also gave us the opportunity to really write down and solidify how we would want to move forward with the presentations of learning and kind of get a 5-year plan, like how we would get all schools to engage, all students to have these opportunities. So it's just something that the state allowed us to apply for and we were chosen for.
Okay. I just wanted other people to get that explanation. I think it's on page 7, we talk about the decline in preparation of kindergarten students. I'd like to address that in a couple of ways. Is that, I know we're talking about bridge to kindergarten, but are there other plans to make sure that we're supporting, specifically that whole preschool effort? And is it included in the budget, and to what extent, or should the board be trying to help you do that?
So are you speaking to additional, I mean, we definitely have a preschool program, but it is limited to the number of seats. We also work in partnership with the county, right, to ensure that there are more seats available. I don't know, Ms. Burke, if you want to add any specifics.
Currently, our numbers are exactly what they are, and it's, as Sloan indicated, it really needs to be, budget considerations for that, as well as facility considerations to grow within the public schools. The county is continuing to grow their mixed delivery model, which is a partnership with public and private preschool opportunities for, but again, this is all for children that meet the income eligibility.
Well, another part of that comment was that the SEL, I think in an executive functions, had gone down with our kindergarten students. So I didn't see an explanation, or maybe I missed it, because we've had a lot on our plates, as to how we plan to address that, and is that in the summer plans as well?
So our summer program for Bridge to K is focused on executive functioning. That is the main, to build those self-regulation skills. So that is a main part of the Bridge to K. We do not have any additional summer programs that we are planning, but this work continues into kindergarten. So it's not that all students arrive with those skills in place, but it is part of our kindergarten program as well.
With my last 15 seconds, I'd like to encourage us to, in our One Fairfax approach to things, I'm not sure that parents are understanding that these things have changed recently. And I wonder how we might be able to get that information out to the public, as well as work with our libraries or the county, to try to make sure that parents understand what they can do or how they can participate with us in addressing these concerns. And I'll need to go back.
Can I make one comment, though?
Yes,
I think
please.
it's also important to, we've all talked about this happened during the pandemic. The measure that was used, the Child Behavior Rating Scale, is an observational tool. They were observing kids virtually. And even Virginia Department of Education noted that some things were not going to be observable virtually. So although this data is really important for us to act on, we also have to look at it in the context of which it was gathered, which puts some caveats to it.
So if I may just respond, if we could get a report on what the changes would be, that would be great.
Dr. Anderson.
Thank you, and thank you for this work.
just jumping into the scorecard and some of these pieces that were in the presentation, I'd like to focus a little bit on digital access. I know that there's some information in the full report, but I'm not sure how much of that our audience is going to be able to dig into. But I would like for you to speak a little bit in terms of how digital access was evaluated, with particular focus on connectivity, because it is one thing to provide our students with a tablet or a device, but it is another for them to be able to access that device because of reliant connectivity. While I do realize we've pivoted from having all of our instruction online, there is still some support that is needed for the devices that we do provide because of all of the investments that we've made and some of the learning opportunities. So if somebody could speak to that, I'll stop there for right now.
So
My time needs to stop.
Dr. Anderson, your concern is certainly one that we have concern about as well. We know we have the availability, but how do we ensure that kids are taking advantage, families are taking advantage of the availability? It's something that we continue to work on with our schools, work on communication to make sure that people know that MiFis are available to families. We do collect information at the beginning of the year, whether families have access in their homes, and then schools in turn can use that information to ensure that they're connecting students who are not connected. During virtual learning, certainly if students were not attending, it was the expectations that schools would be following up to determine why the student was not, was it a connectivity issue, was it something else that was preventing them. So I don't have any hard data on it to say that I think you're looking for, but I would say we have lots of things in place. We have the availability of MiFis, we have the information, and we try and pair that with making sure students take advantage of the opportunity, and then following up when we find that there's a gap.
Thank you. Given that I continue to hear that there's gaps in my community in terms of connectivity, I would like for some intentional planning to evaluate connectivity, not just the availability of devices, because we know we have them. So if that could be a plan that staff could focus on, that would be much appreciated. The other piece that I want to speak to from the scorecard is the college and career readiness. Can you speak to some of the barriers that have resulted in the data that is provided here, where it says, for example, only 80% of our students with disabilities have a plan beyond high school? What is preventing us from gathering that data? Or is it a matter of gathering it, or that the students do not have a plan? Can you start there, please?
So I'll briefly just touch upon the data and then turn it over to Ms. Klemenko for, I think, what you're really trying to get at. The data itself is not missing information. This is based on the information that is available from all our students. So the 80% really does reflect what our students were telling us with basically all of our students with disabilities as they are seniors filling out the senior survey. And so I'll turn it over to Ms. Klemenko for some of the barrier question.
So this data was collected, I believe, at the end of last year. And I think that what I would say, just from my own perspective, is that we definitely had students who were unsure where they were going, maybe more so because of the pandemic. That is self-reported data, so it is not data that is something that we have anything to verify or check. It is just student self-reported data.
Thank you. I guess that brings me to the larger question that's been alluded to earlier, just having the opportunity to review the scorecard, because this is one of those data points that I'm starting to question. How valid is it? If we're getting information from kids, this is what they're planning or not planning to do. What can be our next step, our action to this? So I do want to lend support to the board being able in the near term, to have the opportunity to review the scorecard, not only to align it, as Dr. Presidio has said, to the budget timeline, but I also believe we should be aligning this tightly to the superintendent evaluation process and timeline, as well as a number of other nuggets that Dr. Brabrand shared, because to me, that is not very helpful. And we want this to be the meat of our work And so if there's not an action that could follow that part of the scorecard, I'm really questioning in terms of why we even collect that data. One of the things that I would like to speak, that I'd like for someone to speak to, it's shown up multiple times in this presentation, and of course in the report, page 7, page 8, where you talk about strategies to expand equitable participation. Can you give a little bit more detail? And then I would like to go back, Ms. Koufax, then Rod Koufax.
Okay.
Sorry, Dr. Anderson, could, equitable access to which thing? There's so many things in this report.
There's so many, there's a few, but I think we're looking, I know this is past data, but we're looking to impact future data with our actions, and we're looking to put some teeth to what we said has been done. If we look at the metric performance highlight on page 7, it says reducing opportunity gaps, improving equitable participation among student groups. Let's take this one, for example, algebra, 8th grade. What are some strategies that are being used to achieve this? And how would I or anybody else as a parent will see this in action in the schools?
Thank you. Thanks for that clarification. I appreciate it. And you know, as a reminder, Algebra 1 by 8th grade is an open enrollment, right? So students only need to complete Math 7 in order to access algebra in the 8th grade. So when we have that kind of setup, the question is, well, it's obviously not policy keeping kids in. So what is the barrier? Why are students not feeling ready? Why are they not being encouraged? Why are families not feeling efficacious and putting their child in algebra? So we have been doing some things, working with academic advising and working with math teachers around how do you really support students in making that decision and deciding to take algebra in the 8th grade? And who are the students who perhaps, you know, it might be a stretch for, but that we can support with different scaffolds? There have been schools that have taken intentional actions and basically said, everyone will take this, right? So there's some things that we do at the division level, and there's some things that are happening at school levels. We had one school who said all 8th graders will take Algebra 1 next year, and then they put in the scaffolds and supports to ensure that students would be successful. We do have that caveat that if students aren't successful, you know, there is obviously supports and ways forward for them as well. But it's a variety of things. I think it's also taking a look at our K-6 program, and I'm not just talking about access to advanced math, I'm talking about K-6 program in general, and ensuring that the rigor sets all students up to access that 8th grade algebra.
And I think you also had a similar expansion for AP. Can you speak to some of those details?
So depending on AAP, if you're talking about level 4, or are you talking about like honors courses?
Both.
Yeah, so I mean, we know that with level 4, we continue to work on ensuring that referrals are written for students, and we put local norms in place as well to ensure that we have students getting to the table, so to speak, to be screened, to be found eligible. We also are looking at levels 2 and 3 of advanced academics as excellent experiences for students as well. The Young Scholars Program continues to build students up and prepare them for those. At the honors, I think we've had a lot of, again, it's that same thing, really encouraging students to take that honors class and to kind of stretch, perhaps, where they hadn't thought they would before. And once they've taken one honors class, they take another, and they take another. And again, some principals have gone to some honors for all methodologies to really just encourage students to take that leap.
I know I've run out of time, Ms.
Yes,
Koufax, but I guess a concern that I do have is, why is this important decision being left to be on a school-by-school decision? That there should be some central accountability, some central plan for that. Thank you. I'll stop.
Thank you. We have you on the list for a go back, Dr. Anderson. Ms. Sizemore-Heiser.
Thank you. I have many notes, as you can see. So a couple things I wanted to dig into. First, I wanted to talk about the executive functioning and the statement about, you know, kindergartners having fewer executive functioning skills. I'm wondering, going forward, what we're looking at in terms of executive functioning skills for other students as well. I hear anecdotally from quite a few teachers their seventh graders are acting more like what they'd expect from fifth graders and so on. And I think that's going to be a long-term impact of our students. So I'll stop there and just ask, is there a plan to sort of assess and address executive function needs across K through 12?
So I think some of that falls into our SEL work, right? And there's some alignment there with some of the lessons and some of the, I'm not sure it aligns to our assessment there, but I think that that's where it would fall into, and that students have recognized that students need a little bit more explicit instruction and a more, naming things and really practicing things. So that's where I would think that falls into.
Okay, I just think it's a very important piece, because without those skills, obviously, learning is very difficult. So I do think a renewed emphasis on that is very important. I wanted to talk a little bit about, and I bring it up every time, the students with disabilities graduation rates. And I really appreciate that the Applied Studies diploma is separated out in this data. That's, I think, the first time I've seen that. So I really appreciate that. I'm a little concerned that 9% of our graduating seniors with students with disabilities had the Applied Studies diploma. And I say this because this is in the era where for 2 years for the class of 2021, the SOLs were waived. So accessing that standard diploma, the SOLs are often a barrier, and still we had 9% accessing the Applied Studies diploma. So just a thought looking back, but looking forward, these students with disabilities are going to have significant impacts from the pandemic, but the SOL waiver will likely not be there going forward. And when you look at the SOL pass rates for ELs in third grade pass rates for ELs and students with disabilities, they are really low. So I am concerned the long-term impacts on accessing a standard diploma. There's a lot of talk in here about advanced versus standard. I am focused on making sure those students get a diploma that means something more than a piece of paper. So I guess my question is, what's the analysis and thoughts on the impact of COVID, the SOL pass rates from third grade, and the potential impact on graduating with a standard diploma for ELs and students with disabilities?
Well, I would certainly invite Dr. Boyd, if she has any comments as well, to join us. She's here for Goal 2, but if she has any comments for this question as well, that would be fine. But I would say the long-term impacts, as we've discussed, that's ongoing work that we're going to have to track and measure and monitor the impact of the supports that we're providing right now as part of our ESSER plan. Obviously, we have a methodology to do that. As part of the Goal 1 report, we've got a methodology to do that. And I'm pretty confident that we'll be able to start to eliminate and close these gaps that we're seeing that have resulted from the pandemic over the next several years. I'm very confident that we'll be able to do that. We don't yet have any of the data from the end of this school year, obviously, to look at, but that will be our first touch point to really see how well we're doing in terms of mitigating those longer term effects. The other thing I would say about the report and what we report in here, again, we're reporting on the board approved outcomes and metrics. We certainly, as the board does the work to revise the plan, we certainly could shift and change what we're reporting on. And we recognize, and your advocacy is much appreciated, that we have a lot of work to do, right, with our special education students, not just in terms of getting them back on track after the pandemic, but thinking about post-secondary readiness and what that looks like as well. And the type of, diploma that they choose to graduate is a big piece of that. So, we do have a lot of work to do, certainly around our transitioning process, transition IEPs, post-secondary planning, academic and, career plan work that we need to do with all of our students, but with special education students in particular. And I don't know, Dr. Boyd, if you wanted to offer anything else on that.
Thank you, Dr. Presidio. And just to add on to the information that Dr. Presidio shared, I think that our work regarding literacy is going to be so impactful. I know when we talk about it at the division level, but we know that literacy oftentimes proves to be a barrier and is an area of need for our students with disabilities. And while that will not only be reflected in English language arts performance and similarly in those verified credits for the SOLs, comprehension and understanding that language also impacts students' ability to demonstrate and to learn knowledge in other content areas, our social studies, our science, even in mathematics. And so that work is going to be very, very vital. We're doing the work and partnering across departments around that literacy plan, and we'll have to take a similar approach as we look at closing the achievement gap for mathematics for students with disabilities as well. So I won't belabor the moment, but just wanted to add that as well.
Great, thank you. And I appreciate you mentioning that, because I think too often anecdotally
a lot of our reading programs have been focused on decoding and not on comprehension. So I think that's a real room for growth in terms of getting our students ready. And I'm glad you mentioned the post-secondary, because one of the things I'd love to see, and I know this is based on a previous, is breaking out that CTE data. Because we have college and career readiness, it's access to dual enrollment at college level classes and CTE, but it doesn't really give a good picture of how many students are accessing CTE programming and those intercy certifications on their own. So I'd love to see that broken out to get an idea of that piece of it. One of the questions I had is about, and I know Ms. Dernack Koufax and others have been real champions of young scholars, but what are we doing to ensure that young scholars programs are meeting their targets in terms of growth, so we can help our students earlier access those enrichment and advanced opportunities to set them up for that advanced coursework, honors. I appreciate the honors for all, but sometimes it's too late by then. So what are we doing at this K through 6 to really encourage that enrichment access?
So the Young Scholars Program, has it's a model, right? So we ask that schools really provide additional opportunities for enrichment for those students. That might happen this summer, but it certainly can happen during the school year as well. All of the students are usually involved in advanced academics in level 2 or level 3, so they're having enrichment in those opportunities. They're having opportunities to either be advanced in one curriculum area or across a couple curriculum areas. So there's multiple things that are happening for our young scholars, and I'd be happy to share more of the framework with you or with this group. But it really helps for students to be able to see themselves beyond what's happening in their classroom and have some additional opportunities that does set them up both in knowledge and in really mindset of taking those honors and those advanced classes as they move forward.
The other thing I would add briefly is we definitely appreciate the work that the board did last year to provide for the first time ever line item funding for the Young Scholars Program for all of our schools. So that was really, really important, and that's something that we want to be able to continue to do.
I guess I would just say that I think there's room for really intentional targeting for enrichment, not just young scholars, for students who have these gaps, who try to sort of identify that talent early and develop that talent. I know my time's up. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. Ms. Pekarsky.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate you all bringing this, especially because of last year and the limited data, but even so, I think there is a lot of information here, and especially in the reports, a lot of detail. I've got many questions. I will just say right from the get-go, I have a particular concern about our ELLs, not only because of what some of this data is saying, but what I'm hearing anecdotally from my schools. As we know, the pandemic hit our ELLs particularly hard, and that is going to take many years to work through. So one of my questions is, what are we doing for kind of these transition points, like 6th to 7th, or 9th, 8th through 9th, where these kids really haven't met some of these skills and are behind in language acquisition by years? Do we have anything specific that we are doing at the transition points to help with preparation?
So I know that there is communication at those transition points, but I'm going to phone a friend and see if Mr. Polio has anything specific that we do.
Yeah, sure. I mean, we have, similar to the transition meetings that you'll have for students with disabilities, I think that not necessarily on an individual level, but there's lots of communication between elementary to middle and middle to high. First of all, it's starting around now, actually, when course selection happens, to try and make sure that students are placed appropriately in courses. At the middle school level, all students take all English learners take an English language development course that specifically is geared toward their level. So that's in addition to English. They're in, for example, English 7 or English 8 plus English language development. And students who are level 1 or 2 are generally in a double block of mathematics to try and help make sure that they can catch up if they're below grade level in mathematics. That's at the 9th grade level and at the 7th grade level that we look at those very carefully, starting around now, looking toward next year. The other thing, we do lots of work in the summer with our students who are at level 1 and 2. So, I mean, it's a year-round, we really need to meet the needs of students year-round. So for high school level students, we have both students have credit recovery if they need credit recovery, if they've already been in high school. And then students who are transitioning from 8th to 9th grade, and 6th to 7th grade, we have an online English language development program that's open to all English learners. We've actually done it for years, pre-pandemic, where we give out laptops. Now students have laptops, but they have access to a teacher online every week, a few times a week, just to simply practice English. So that's something that keeps students going during the summertime. In addition to that program, we also have for level 1 students in the summertime, we have an intensive numeracy and literacy work. So for students that are level 1 and 2, and that happens face-to-face at our high school summer school sites. So that's something that when the transition's happening for those students, that we can make sure that at least they're getting lots of both oral language work and specific skill work in reading and mathematics. There's probably a number of other things I could rattle off about not just transitions from middle to high, but also just in terms of what we do to try and increase English language progress.
Yeah, thank you. I think, and I'm sure you all have it, but a detailed plan about this specific group of students when it comes to recovery from the pandemic, because I appreciate the online program, but we saw that this group was the most difficult to get to log on. So anyway, I just have a lot of questions around more details with our ELLs and how we're going to close these gaps, because they were already such, had such desperate outcomes to begin with, that I worry how we're going to close what has widened during this pandemic. Switch over to the devices. This is one that's a lot of money that we've invested in these. And, when we look at the ROI, I've got to see, what is that, right? What is the return on this large investment? It's got to be academic. I know exposure, all of those things are important, but when we're talking about one-to-one, where is the academic progress that results from this huge investment in a tool? Because we're investing in this tool at a much larger rate in terms of dollars than our MTSS. On that slide. So can you speak a little bit towards that and what work you will be doing and what you expect that correlation with academic success to be?
Well, I think we'll all kind of take a turn at answering this one. I mean, it's a really important question, and it is hard to measure the impact of one variable when we're putting so many different supports in place at the same time, right? So, I mean, it does make it very difficult to say, what made a difference? Is it tutoring that made a difference? Is it, the changes that we made to our literacy program? Is it the devices that we provided? So it's hard to draw those, large-scale conclusions, I think, in the data. And certainly I'd defer to Leedy in terms of a measurement answer on that. But that's part of what we've been trying to do with the Johns Hopkins work, is really look at, how is teaching and learning changing in our schools and in our classrooms. We have collected data going back 5 years from those classrooms that were the early adopters to look at student performance. You can see gains, but you don't always see the large-scale gains that maybe we would like to see with such a large monetary investment. But you can see gains in that early data that Hopkins did. But I think more than anything, I mean, the devices have become a core instructional tool that we can't really do without anymore. And that's even when we don't have to do virtual learning. Everything that we're doing is so embedded now with technology in terms of making our curriculum materials accessible to students, trying to make our materials accessible to families outside of what's happening in the school day, how we do adoption of curriculum materials. Most of the vendors' curriculum materials now are digital so that they can be updated and replaced much more frequently than being updated on a 7-year cycle. So I mean, they really have become a core instructional tool in what we do on a daily basis. So that's something that we certainly could look at, again, with a revision of the strategic plan, what types of specific, outcome measures would you like to see with that investment? And we could certainly, collaborate with the board on that more.
Thanks. It's a topic of interest. I'm not going to belabor this point, but I think it's something that we have to discuss. Looking at summer school, when we talk about, the early skills, are we going to have bridge to first grade this year?
And that would be your time.
I know.
So we are not, we have sunsetted Bridge to First Grade. We did put that in place last year because we had many, many kindergartners who had not been in person, right? So we did sunset that, but our first graders are part of our criteria for our math and literacy programs. So there's still programs for them, there's just not the Bridge to First.
You got it. Ms. Ms. Corbett Sanders, sorry.
Thank you, and thank you for this presentation. I, for one, am very appreciative of the data that is provided on this chart, and I would be disappointed if we started peeling back on the data, because the data allows us to inform our decision-making. I do have a couple of questions that are really related to your presentation today, which I thought was very good. On page 7, if you could pull that up, you have a reference to that we're not graduating with equivalent levels of proficiency. We can stop until we have it up. I'm sorry, we're letting the clock go when I'm waiting for something, so I just lost 7 seconds. The reason I ask about this is that that is directly linked, frankly, to the data on page 10 where we talk about elimination of gaps, and 8 of 11 schools have on-time graduation resource teachers, but they're not all coming out, or that they're not, the data doesn't necessarily show that all of those resource schools are performing at the same level. Based on those two, it would be very helpful to understand from you where these disparities are occurring. Is it by region? Is it by individual schools? Or is it by individual subgroups? So, for example, as Ms. Rachna Sizemore-Heiser mentioned, the concern about the applied studies diploma. And if we can stop the clock.
I'm going to try to address, if I forget some of it, just let me know. But I think when we look at the data for the on-time graduation rates, there are definitely discrepancies between our student groups in terms of the percentage that are actually graduating. So you have some differences there to begin with. And then you have the breakout of differences between those who are earning different types of diplomas as well, which is not entirely well understood at this point, but I think it also speaks to some of what Ms. Klemenko was talking about when she was addressing open enrollment at the middle school, being able to take high school courses in middle school. It starts even in middle school, and so that's kind of going on. When you focus on the on-time graduation teachers, so a lot of these resources that we looked at in particular for this report, those teachers had been in for 1 year. Now that 1 year may or may not have impacted what was happening. We can, I don't have specifics on which regions. I could check into that and provide that. I'd be happy to look into that more and let you know specifically an update on where that's happening. But overall, those on-time graduation teachers who were in for 1 year are dealing with students, if they're graduating at that point, who have had already a minimum of 3 years of high school coursework prior to that. So some of the issue is to make sure that we're continuing to track what's happening, and you would hope that over time, as these graduation teachers are starting to work with our students as soon as they enter high school, that they are supporting ongoing improvements over the course of the time, and that you see more and more of an impact of them no matter where they are. So while we did see these improvements, and that improvement may have been somewhat related to changes during the pandemic year that the state put in terms of what was required to graduate that year versus prior years, or it could have been related to the impact of the on-time graduation teachers, that we need to make sure that we track that and understand how much of it is really related to them, and focusing in on the different kinds of student groups that they're supporting, because it really is a 4-year endeavor more so than a 1-year endeavor. So I'm not sure I really hit everything that you're asking about, but it is something that we think we do need to delve into more and understand more fully what is really happening with those supports that have been put in so far.
And I just wanted to add that we're happy this spring to be piloting a tool that will really have some graduation kind of warning flag systems built in, so that looking at students very early will really support the work of those on-time graduation coordinators to be able to be very targeted and specific. I also think in year one of those jobs, I think there's definitely the opportunity for people to grow into those jobs and for us to learn to each other sort of as that collaborative team.
So I would like to have the data disaggregated so I better understand the graduation rates by school and by category, and by those schools that had a support system in place and those that didn't, and of those schools that had a support system in place, those that, 8 out of 11 is about 80%, like less than 80% success rate. So I'd like to better understand that. The second thing is I would like to better see, following up on Ms. Pekarsky's comment about the return on investment. You had on page, let's see, page 8, if we can go to that, significant numbers and of investment. And what I'd like to see is a mapping between those investments and our outcomes, because that should inform our decision-making of what we maybe need to do more of and what we maybe need to do less of. I would also, so if we could have that mapping, is that possible?
So some of that mapping, to the extent that we could do it, is available in the full narrative report. I think some of the issues this year are that understanding exactly what was happening when a lot of our performance indicators were going down makes it difficult to really talk return on investment, because you have sort of a negative return. And so that's some of the issues. To the extent that we could do it, it is in the report. But going beyond that for last year will probably be difficult in terms of that. So we did couch it under the specific aspirations so that you can see what actions are supposed to go to which aspirations. But kind of beyond that, we probably can't go too far beyond what's currently in the report.
Well, I would say going forward, we should have that mindset of trying to do that more. On page 17, you were talking about timeframes for addressing the impact of COVID. And I understand in some jurisdictions, they've actually had a fixed 3-year plan to show what the expectation is. Why aren't we doing that?
I don't know that we're not doing that. Our ESSER plan that we reported on a couple weeks ago, is a multi-year plan with the goals established to have all students on grade level. So, I think we are doing that, and we're going to be reporting to the board periodically, multiple times a year, about where we're at in terms of meeting those targets. So I think we're doing that.
And I think we need to be careful when we say require multiple years of targeted efforts and we need to link that to the ESSER work then, because it really is a holistic look of not only the ESSER work, but also this work here, which started pre-pandemic. I will need to go back because I have a couple more comments. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. McLaughlin.
Thank you. I'll start with the GLOWs that really appreciate the 105-page report. And if our clerks could bring that up, I want to reference my questions to the narrative report. I think that we're really headed in the right direction for substantive information coming to the board. And there's a lot here. But staying at a macro level, because I've only got 2.5 minutes to say anything, to my colleagues, my concern is that we still have to get to where our strategic focus is. I feel like in this 105-page report, it's like a needle in a haystack. I can start throwing out to you all the different things that I'm looking at in terms of AP pass rates, what were we doing with MTSS, what were we doing with the virtual PD, where are we on, our PSAT, our AVID. I mean, I don't physically have the time to be able to talk about where my concerns are. And this is why I think we need to have a deeper conversation with our superintendent to help you guys as a team, because I really didn't find that the PowerPoint really correlated as strongly as I would hope on drawing out things that I would say, wow, that's a red flag. We really need to be mindful of what's happening here. I mean, on page 42 of the report, where we talk about the AAP pass advance rates for reading and math SOLs, I mean, I haven't heard anybody to date bring it up, but for a premier school system, and we have almost a 20 percentage point drop in every one of our categories, that's huge, because these were the students we expected would have, other assets and supports to mitigate the learning loss that occurred during COVID. And so if it's this dramatic for this population, then again, what is this happening for all of our students who struggle? In the minute I have left, I do have a quick question about the MTSS information. It just, it says we spent $28 million, but it comes out to $143,000 per school. As a contrast, right above it on page 18, when we talked about virtual professional development for our teachers, it said we distributed that to 49,722 teachers, but we only have 15,000 teachers in the school system approximately. So these are things that, I want to kind of point out, first of all, that I'd like a little more information, because I don't think the MTS section gave us enough on how did we spend 28 million. And number two, I do want clarity on why we list 49,000 teachers when we don't have 49,000 teachers. So those are my two questions with my 3 seconds.
So in terms of the teachers, this was related to different kinds of training that teachers went to. So the count, let's say you went to 3 trainings, you would have been counted 3 times. So that's where that really big number comes from, and why it's a lot more than the 15,000 teachers that we have.
And that's an example of where I think we really need to be more clear to the board and the public, because otherwise someone reading the report could then come back and criticize us. And then for the MTSS, 28 million. I mean, it just says $143,000 per school, but I think we need to know a little bit more.
Yeah, I think we would have to get more detail for you. I mean, I do think it's basically, it's a time factor, right? Because it's not that we bought things, it's how people spent time on the MTSS, either getting professional development or, I'm assuming, spending time in the meetings, the cost of central office, people who are doing the professional development and developing the resources. So it's all people's time. But certainly there could be a further breakdown, I think. Would there be able to be that? Yeah.
I mean, to my colleagues, I think in the end, we have to start asking the questions about correlation versus causality. Are these investments just a correlation to what we see changes, or did they causally improve? Because 28 million is a lot of money, and I want to know that it's actually doing it versus other things we're doing that just in a correlation way. So I know I'm out of time. If you can put me on a go back.
Absolutely. Ms. Amesh.
Thank you. Thank you to our staff for the presentation. Building off of whether it's MTSS or the technology ROI analysis, what prevents us from doing something like a regression discontinuity, even knowing it's not perfect, but even just seeing change?
So historically, there have been a couple of reasons why regression discontinuity hasn't worked very well. FCPS, and I think rightly so, typically believes that we should give whatever resources or supports and interventions are needed for students to all the students who need them, so that separation between those who aren't getting them and are getting them tends to not be super black and white. And that causes problems with that kind of a design, where you're trying to take the kids who are getting the resources and then that little group that's like right above the bubble of the kids who are getting it and compare them to each other. So just historically, it's been difficult for us to do it. The other thing with this is that very often a lot of the things that we're looking at are broad initiatives, and I think it goes back to something that Dr. Presidio was saying earlier, that it is very hard sometimes to tease out the differences between what all the things are that we're providing, all the supports, all the interventions, and tease out how one specific thing is working or not working. Kind of to piggyback a little bit on what Dr. Brabrand was saying, the stronger the focus we can have and the narrower the focus we can have, the more something like that could get done, and the stronger the data could be for the return on investment and kind of across the board. So some of it is just trying to tease out much more narrower sets of things that we're specifically trying to do for a narrower set of aspirations or targets, so that we can do more of that, versus right now there's a lot of things in here, a lot of important things that we've been doing, but being able to really tease that out in a strong return on investment is very difficult.
That's very helpful, and I hope that helps answer some of the concerns as well. Thank you. I want to reiterate Ms. Pekarsky's comments actually on English learners. I think I would support work on a separate plan for that. And I think it speaks more broadly to this equity equality issue that we're constantly struggling with, where, when we look at where resources are invested, do we every year give a little bit to every pot, or do we really look at where the needs are most severe and try to bring them up to a level base, right? So it's a constant work in progress there, and again, would support the development of a separate plan. I did want to ask, what does the feedback loop look like for you all internally? I know as a board, we still have had to develop and have not, as a new board, put together a revised strategic plan. But can you explain a little bit more about so now we have these outcomes, right? So what does that loop look like internally? I would have asked Dr. Brabrand, but.
I'm not sure I fully understand the question. I could maybe try to answer it, and then maybe you can help steer me in the right direction. I would say, this report is always helpful for us in terms of setting priorities for the next year. As Ms. Klemenko said, though, this report's a little strange in terms of its timing, because we're already 3/4 of the way through this year. So we tried to focus on some of the things that we did internally with the information before it was published, for you as board members and for the community, to help inform our actions for this year. So, for example, in the Instructional Services Department, all of our programs basically set program improvement goals and priorities for the year, just like you would in a school, develop a school improvement plan. The data contained in this report really helps identify and prioritize where we need to do the work and where we need to establish those goals and those targets. We also get feedback with a lot of the work from the schools themselves, so directly from schools that we're working with. One example that we've already talked about is the Johns Hopkins, work that we're doing around, instructional technology and the focus groups that are conducted that give us feedback about the work that we're doing qualitatively to help us, better refine the supports that we're providing to schools. And we do that across the board for, Project Momentum, school support, all of our different programs. So there's a variety of different ways that we, collect that information that drives that feedback loop.
Is that tied to budget planning internally?
It is, and you might remember, I guess it was about a year ago now, we did the ISD budget review. I think that's the only department where we did the budget review, but we did a deep dive in how we set and establish our budget goals. So we try to have all of that operate on an annualized calendar, but it's a lot of work. I mean, it's a lot of work to track and manage, and timelines don't always match up. So definitely there's things that, we don't always plan for in our budget that are pieces of the work that we need to do. And then we have to, come and try to figure out how do we adjust for that within our department budgets or within the division budget. We're going to do third quarter budget review with the board on Thursday night, and we're going to talk about, the need for additional summer school funding. So that's one example. But that happens from time to time for sure.
Yeah, I think, maybe this is a conversation in the future, with the future leader, I don't know, but really tying some of these pieces in, I think is essential. In the budget conversation, I've brought up we need a needs review process. We need some kind of needs assessment procedure, right? And then here we have clearly metrics that show us where some of the needs are most dire. Syncing some of those, I think, would be really, would move the needle perhaps in some of the issues, especially the achievement gap, which I think, for many years, we continue to struggle with this. I often wonder, are we successful in some of our metrics because we have the good fortune of having many wealthy families, many invested families in our community, or is it because of the transformative work we're doing? I think it's a little bit of both, and I'm hoping we can lean a little bit more on the transformative work we're doing, perhaps through some of the ways that we can overlay, the assessment process, the budgeting, how we prioritize our investment, which brings me actually in the short term to another question. How does this overlay with the iterative work that we're doing on ESSER, and then even the literacy work? Is there any, collaboration, conversation going on amongst those projects?
So I'm trying to think about the best way to answer that. I think all of this work is tied towards the same strategic plan outcomes, right? When we talk about that desired outcome of closing gaps, the work that we're doing around ESSER is built around closing those gaps and, narrowing those gaps as quickly as possible. That's how we built our ESSER plan. That's how we've designed our investments in the ESSER plan. And the same thing is true for the work around literacy. And Dr. Boyd, I think, spoke to it really well, that when we can get those foundational literacy skills, we see our gaps close in other areas as well, not just in reading performance. So all of that work, I think, that we're doing in both of those other sectors that you mentioned, ESSER and literacy, really is tied to, the student success goals and closing those gaps.
Yeah, I guess I think of it as, okay, as a school leader, right? We'll look at this data. We're presented with this, we say, oh, okay, here are where the gaps are. There's an ESSER process going on. The ESSER process addresses XYZ aspects of it. Perhaps it doesn't cover everything. Now we have a budget process going on. Where else can we identify need that ESSER is not addressing that remains reflected here, right? Like that's the kind of conversation go ahead.
No, it's a good point, but just to clarify what we did with our schools when they built their ESSER plans is we didn't build a separate ESSER plan. We built a school improvement / ESSER plan. We built one plan because we didn't want them to have competing plans. We wanted them to see everything together. And the ESSER funds that they got were the investments that they were able to make in professional development, instructional materials and supplies, direct tutoring and support services to students, all part of their school improvement / ESSER plan. So what you're saying is exactly, how we tried to approach that work with our schools.
Yeah, and hopefully with the broader budget too, maybe that's a future aspiration.
So much, if I could just add, and just know that as the plans were built at the school level, they were reviewed at many different levels. So at the region level, at the central office level with different departments. And so there is an interconnectedness to this work that I think is essential to getting the results that we want.
Yeah, no doubt. And I think centering that North Star in all of that will help us push, move the needle on what has lagged, not for y'all's fault, but just over the years, remaining issue. The final question I had was, how do we incorporate the Virginia growth assessment into this? Because these metrics are static. I know that's new. Have we yet? Maybe not. Maybe that's part of revisiting this.
So in terms of the strategic plan, and this is last year's data, so we didn't have it last year. Moving forward, if we did the same kind of report this year, we might dig into the VGA, the Virginia Growth Assessment. But more critically, in terms of what we're doing this year, the VGA is being used with our look at the ESSER accountability that we're doing, so how our students are doing, and we're going to see whether we can use it as a new test I'm sure the state is trying to make it the best test it can be, but there's also potentially some wiggle room there that it won't do exactly everything quite the way we want it to, or the state wants it to. So it's something that we're looking at and including as part of what we want to take a look at for the ESSER accountability reporting that we're doing. But we'll have to see kind of whether it pans out as expected or whether there are kind of hiccups in it that make the data not as usable as we would like.
Would you
Mr.
like to
Greenfelder,
speak?
Did you want to address that? Okay.
Okay, all right.
Okay.
All right. Yes, I'll take a brief turn. I do want to thank you all up there for this presentation. As all school systems in the U.S. have seen, this worldwide pandemic has had an impact on our student learning and our student success. But, you know, we've also seen many, many supports that we have put into place. And I really want to say, use this time to say thank you, because I don't completely agree with Dr. Brabrand's assessment. We maybe have not talked about the strategic plan in the way we did when it was first brought up. But the things that we're doing are part of the strategic plan. Everything, all the things Dr. Ivy just spoke of, how we go school by school, ESSER monies, they were all put into place as a result of this. Are we where we want to be? We weren't prior to COVID. Now we've taken a step back. I think as a board, what we have to do, we have to work with all of you here who are on this team, who know the system, who know what's happening, and know where we've had successes and how we can build upon them, and know where we're still struggling. And as we get a new superintendent, we're going to be relying on all of you to make sure that we as a board come together with a new leader to make sure we are progressing in the ways we were prior to the pandemic, the steps we have to take now to go beyond the additional, things we need to bring up as a result of this pandemic. So I think that's important. I really don't have any other questions other than I do want to talk about some things that are strategic and that have been left behind. Dr. Presidio made the talk about pre-K and how we got a county board together with our school team, skipped, and then skipped has additional priorities, but we really need to, because I said this to Dr. Presidio yesterday on the phone. I had a standard line. We know that for every dollar we invest in pre-K, somewhere between $10 and $15 are saved in the long run on that child, because they require less remediation. They may not be less incarceration. There is a list of things that happen when that child comes to school ready to learn. Bridge to K, we talked about. I'm glad I was on the Child Care Advisory Council when there were 5 schools in Bridge to K, and now we have them everywhere. So thank you for that. I think my time's up, so I just want to say, I know the data points, the scorecard is not where we want to be, but I feel confident that you all know where we need to be. We have some additional dollars. We are able this year with full funding to get at least some salaries in a good place. So thank you. We will continue to work, and I can see a new beginning on the horizon with a new superintendent, a team who's ready to get that strategic plan revised and continue the work that you've done. So thanks.
Thank you, Ms. Derenak Kofax. We will go.
Dr. Ivy wants
I just
I'm
wanted to
sorry.
say thank you for your comment, and I think it ties a little bit to Ms. Keys-Gamarra's comment around communication and how are we reporting out and sharing the news that we are doing. And I think with time here, we will be able to tell that narrative and to kind of to work on prioritizing our work and picking different metrics, and we look forward to working with the board and our new superintendent in doing that, and communicating it out in a way that everyone understands and all stakeholders and communities.
So without objection, colleagues, just as a time check, we can push 15 minutes to have every board member have just one go back minute, given that this is a longer presentation than the following one, and we'll push lunch that way too. Okay? All right.
I have a process question to really help us. You know, we all have the ability to send questions and talk with staff. What I'd like to see is if we could just have a minute that we're speaking to each other about your takeaways, because it's the Q&A that eats up the time. That's just
All right.
thought.
I will let each board member decide what they want to do, but thank you. All right, so we can go ahead, Ms. Keys-Gamarra.
I almost want clarification with Ms. McLaughlin. I was like, how do I adjust my brain for that? I'm sorry. Oh, okay, good, thank you. Oh, okay.
All right, guys, go ahead, Ms. Keys-Gamarra.
That shouldn't be my time. Okay, all right. So yes, I was looking forward to speaking after Ms. Darren Koufax because precisely, it doesn't mean that we're not doing those things, but I did take a look at our website in between my chances, my opportunities to speak, and it does not tell the overall story. And that's, I think, part of the problem, right? This is important work. I do not disagree with this work. But does it tell the whole story? And so I do look forward to our community. I think it's caused some angst with people, and it's part of the criticism that we have received, even looking at the website. So I'm sorry that our communications person isn't here, because I do hope in the future we can have that conversation on how to better get that across. On page 9, you talked about expansion of project-based assessment, and so I'll start there. I'm also going to ask for disaggregated information for the 8 of 11 schools staffed on time graduation response teachers. How are we addressing the different groups? Those are my primary 2 questions.
That's your time. Thank you.
That's it. I'm done.
Does anybody want to answer her questions?
Well, so Ms. Corbett-Sanders asked some questions about the on-time graduation data as well. So I think, you know, what we typically do is follow that next step process, and, you know, anything where we have board consensus, then of course we respond to those formally. If you have questions informally, then we're happy to respond to those with you individually as well. But it sounds like there's a few board members that want some information on on-time graduation coordinators. The performance-based assessment work is
It's project-based assessment is what it says. I know you know better than I do, but that's what I read.
And I will say that was identified late yesterday as a mistake. It should have been performance-based assessment. Project-based learning, PBLs, are still part of what's happening in Fairfax County. We're very committed to that work, but this was specific to performance-based assessment as related to the waivers that we got from VDOE last year. So I apologize for that.
No worries.
Okay. Thank you. Dr. Anderson? Are you still with us?
I'm here. Sorry, caught me mid-sneeze. Thank you. I wanted to go back to my original question, and hopefully Dr. Brabrand or Dr. Ivy can speak to this. I appreciated the answer regarding what certain principals are doing to advance coursework for all students. I guess my question is, why is this not happening in a larger scale? What are the central office expectations around that kind of provision? Why leave it up to individual principals to handle?
Well, I'll certainly defer to Dr. Ivy, but I would say, you know, we had a few schools that were interested in moving forward faster during the pandemic, and they felt that they had the leadership capacity and the staff capacity and culture in their buildings to be able to do that, and we were supportive of allowing them to move forward. But we were not in a position where we could move forward more aggressively with some of those actions during the pandemic, when we were more focused on making sure that we're supporting, you know, core instruction and supporting work around closing some of the existing gaps that we knew that we had coming into this school year.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I do want to laud those principals for taking that initiative. But my concern is that we're going to continue to expand the gaps when we don't provide information to the entirety, access to the entirety of the division. It's not one Fairfax. It's not advancing opportunity for all. So I will add that as one of my next steps because I do have more questions there. Secondly, I wanted to speak about the AAP results, and I apologize if this came up, but I had some glitches here. Who can speak to that a little bit? I noticed that our students in AAP really had decreased performance. Have we been able to determine the rationale for that?
So I think you're speaking of the percentage that passed advanced on the reading and math assessments. Is that what you're speaking?
You know what? Actually, I was looking at Appendix C, which is page 90 of the report. And it shows up in a couple of places, but that's the one that really struck me.
Just clarifying. I'm going to stop her. And that's your time, Dr. Anderson, after that answer.
Yeah. Yes. So, I mean, I think that these students, just like all of our other students, experienced a year like no other, as we say. And so this dip, it doesn't mean that they failed. It just means they were not performing at the similar level as advanced pass. So I don't think I have a specific reason except for that they, too, were involved in virtual learning and essential standards and showed that decrease.
And I would add to what Ms. Klemenko just discussed that we do think that part of this was due to the pandemic. But one of the reasons we put this into the appendix rather than the main body of the report is that this particular metric doesn't necessarily have entirely valid information attached to it because of differences in who took the tests and who didn't take the tests. And so some of it is the kind of, to get very technical, the denominator in this is all the AAP students, but you could only pass the test if you took the test, and not all our students took the test. We were following the same business rules that we use every year, but in prior years, all of our students basically took the test who would have been included in the denominator. So we had, this is kind of basically deflated artificially by the fact that not all our students took the test. But we do think that over and above that, there's other evidence elsewhere that we did have lower pass rates as well at the pass advanced level. So there's a little bit of the COVID impact. And then the reason this was removed and put in an appendix is because the business rules we typically follow to get to this metric did not work very well last year when we didn't have all our students taking the SOLs.
All right. I know Ms. Marin just joined us. She didn't get her chance. So 3 minutes on the clock, please. Ms. Marin.
Thanks. Oh, I've been here the whole time. I just didn't have anything to share just now. I do want to share with my colleagues that I think this conversation just further highlights and gels for me the need for us to really invest the time in our agenda development to make time to do this really strategic work. So just over the last few weeks, we've had conversations related to the budget and the CIP, amongst all the other things that we've been working on, things like AAP, and just thinking of Ms. Darnett Koufax, how she posits it as special education. AAP is special ed for gifted students. What is it really going to take to focus on that population of students? Things like our students that are clustered by their poverty levels. What are we going to do to address that as we think about these services when we talk about our ELLs and our students of color who are typically those who fall into that category? We still have yet to hire a chief equity officer. We're going to be onboarding a new superintendent as well as also a new head board clerk. So my vision for us is to really be focused on the governance work that we need to do to be strategic. We get a lot of input from staff. I think we need to sit with it and make sense of it and plan time for our board to really make meaning of it and get into that strategic planning process, both through our own board retreats, but strategic planning with the new superintendent. I mean, we're coming up on this really amazing opportunity to work together with this new person in our leadership team. So that is really what I wanted to share in terms of digesting all of this. We really need to make some decisions to to go forward with all of the information we've been culling together here. So I will leave it at that for consideration. And I look forward to the chair and vice chair in helping us schedule that kind of time and prioritizing it among other new work that, and really determining, is it really necessary to do more new work, or do we need to wrestle with the things that have been in front of us and move away from the, post being in the throes of COVID operational kind of stance that really isn't our lane. So let's get back into that policy-making lane, review our policies, create the agendas that are going to let us do that kind of strategic work. Thank you.
All right, back at 1 minute on the clock, please, and we will have Ms. Sizemore-Heiser.
Great, thank you. And I'm actually very happy to follow with Ms. Marin because I think we have a wonderful strategic plan here, and I really applaud the work of the board that put this together. And Ms. Derenak-Kofax is very correct that we have been doing the work on the strategic plan, and we have been doing this equity work. So I think that's wonderful, but I do think, as Ms. Marin said, that it's time, maybe finally coming out of the throes of this crazy pandemic, to take a focus back on this work and think about where are we now. Things are different than when this was developed. We've had the pandemic, we've had growing gaps, we've increased our performance-based assessments and project-based assessments. We've learned that maybe on-time graduation for some students, right, if we're not letting them leave with the tools to be successful post-secondary, isn't the best metric. We've learned that perhaps we can't subsume diploma types into one. Even on the scorecard, we still say 95% for students with disabilities. That includes the applied studies. So I do think there is real space for us to work together as a team, for you to take what's reported in this strategic plan and what we've done and help guide us, and for us to have those conversations on what have we learned, where do we strategically want to go as a system, and where do we strategically want to focus on to help close these gaps and move our system forward. So I just put that out there.
Ms.
We look
Pekarsky?
forward to that.
I'm sorry. Go ahead, Dr. Ivy.
I just said we really look forward to doing
great.
that work and focusing on the main thing here, which is what's best for our kids, all of our kids.
Thank you, Dr. Ivy. Ms. Pekarsky.
Yeah, thank you. Just to piggyback off of that too, I think it's time to bring that program review back to the table and have these conversations about being strategic instead of one-offs. I want to invest in this, I want to invest in that. We've got to bring that back if we're going to be strategic. So I do hope there is, board support for getting that on our agenda ASAP, because I know, Dr. Presidio, you've done a lot of work around that, and you would, I don't want to speak for you, but I'm hoping that you want to partner with us to kind of get that moving along, because it'll help kind of organize all of us. And the other part that I also wanted to touch base on was the on-time graduation and the breaking out of the applied diplomas. And, we need to get that disaggregated data to understand, because maybe for some of our special education students, it's better to not have the on-time graduation, but take advantage of that little extra time in order to be successful in, post K-12. So thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Pekarsky. Ms. Corbett-Sanders.
Yes, thank you, and I'm pleased to follow Chair Pekarsky, and also follow up on what Ms. McLaughlin said about speaking to each other, because what we really are talking about here is how do we achieve the FCPS promise for every child in Fairfax County. And I think that the work is really underway to do so, but I don't think that we have clearly communicated what the FCPS promise is beyond graduating from school and being college and career ready. And I think that we need to dig in deep and more fully describe what that FCPS promise is for all of our students. And for example, when I hear that there is a couple of our schools that are having honors for all students, that's not an FCPS promise for all. That means that it depends on what school you go to. And so I would urge us that we have a holistic approach to defining what is the FCPS promise. And I look forward to getting into that work with all of you.
Thank you, Ms. Corbett-Sanders. Ms. McLaughlin.
Picking up on that, I recognize with 200 schools, we we will often need to pilot something. Let's look and see how it's going and then expand it outward. But I would like to see that that is a framework on how the superintendent presents it to the board. That, you know, we ran these pilots, this is what we found, and this is how we're going to now expand it so that, to Ms. Corbett-Sanders' point, we're not just having pockets of excellence that, depending on where you bought your home, your kids will have exposure to that. On a very macro level, I would say that what I hope is, number one, our goal reports cannot be squeezed into 2 hours. So this was data rich, and I think you technically, to Ms. Marin's point, you need to spend a day talking about so much that's in here. Number two, what I really hope going forward is we will have a superintendent who will harness the talent that his team has sitting here before us, but you really do bring us your key strategic analysis on, you know what we found in this 105-page report, we've got to do X, Y, and Z. All right,
Thank you. Ms. Tolan.
I just wanted to follow up quickly on a remark Ms. Pekarsky made about the program review. Ms. Rachna Sizemore-Heiser and I have been having conversations recently with Dr. Presidio and Ms. Klemenko on that review and what the next steps might be coming. We had that one work session and didn't really come up with any conclusions from that. In our conversations, we have learned that staff routinely do some more, organic reviews of, different programs and things that they've got going on. For example, they're looking at STEAM right now across the schools. We, of course, have our CTE review that is going on, and we have the special education review. So those are big pieces, and so we have an email drafted to the board, which we haven't sent yet, to just state all of this. We'll get this out to you quickly to just say all of these pieces will come together nicely for, a potential look at these programs, in this whole strategic view that we're talking about, as we move forward with the new superintendent.
Thank you, Ms. Tolan. All right. That leaves me with my minute. I completely agree with everything that's been shared in this last round. I don't think that pass rates and graduation rates are sufficient for the excellence we can aim for, but then also mindful of the equity and equality challenge I talked about. So just continuing to look at how we can be a little bit more strategic and intentional. Does anything prevent us from doing things like individualized learning plans? I know Montgomery has adopted those after the pandemic. I think it's an exceptional possibility. I would urge my colleagues to look into something like that. Obviously, IEPs are legally required for special ed, but some school divisions have pulled off a situation where they have similar models for every kid. Dr. Presidio, I don't know if you want to talk about what thought has been given to that.
Well, I think that would require a lot more discussion there. Depending on how you define what an individual student plan would look like, has a lot of workload implications, depending on how broad that is. I would say we do academic and career plans with all of our students in middle and high school, and that's something that we've been working on for a number of years. I think that's a first step for us, is to be able to do that and to do that really well. And again, that could be something that we could talk about later as part of the program review discussion that Ms. Tolan was talking about.
Yeah, it would certainly be huge, and I think colleagues, again, I really think we should look into this individualized learning plan possibility. Finally, you mentioned the tutoring piece has been adopted, very exciting news. Can you just share, for the sake of our community, when and where that can be accessed?
So we've just completed the contract, which is great, and what is going to be provided is free, on-demand, virtual tutoring for any student who wants it, any family member who would like their student to participate. It's available basically 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So we're really, really excited to be able to offer this service. It is not available yet. We just completed the contract, and now we have to do the integration of the systems, because again, this is involving the technology system components from the vendor and intersecting that with our own FCPS technology components. So it's still going to be a number of weeks before we can get that finalized, but our IT department is really expediting it and working on that as hard as they can. So we're hoping sometime early in the month of April is what we're targeting at this point.
Great. Thank you so much. That'll be very exciting for our families. With that, we're just about on time to break for lunch. We will come back around 1:45 for our Goal 2 report. Thank you.